All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Joe, he's Nick, and you are listening to part 3 of this week's episode of the Nick and Joe Show. So if you're listening to the show live, thanks for sticking with us. If you're listening to the podcast, good Monday morning. And if you want to join in the conversation live, click on the chat bubble, and you may have to register, or you may have to log in if you're already registered. That's to confirm that you're a flesh and blood human being, a real flesh and blood human being, not a liberal lurker, troublesome troller, roaming robot, or malignant algorithm. I think I got them all there, Nick. I think I got
them all, yeah.
You think I got them all there?
Otherwise, just, yep, you did. The only thing you left out was an otherwise bad guy.
Or a bad guy. Okay,
that's right.
That's very Batman of you.
Yeah. Well, I've been watching too much
guys.
Raymond Reddington.
The bad guys. And listen, if you're listening to the podcast and you want to leave a comment, you can do that exactly the same way that I just explained. You just click on that chat bubble, and if you have to register, if you aren't registered, go ahead and do that. And if you have to log in because you're already registered, go ahead and do that as well. But we like to hear our comments. We like to read the comments of our listeners, whether it's the live show or it is the podcast. And we promised that we were not going to talk about COVID this week, and we're not going to. So I just mentioned it again. I know I shouldn't have, but there it is. Let's talk about China and the growing tensions in the Far East. Nick, take it away.
Okay, well, as anybody who's been looking at anything other than a hypodermic needle, there are other events going on in the world. Some of them have very serious consequences. I would even say some of them even look like war clouds. As many of our listeners will know, Taiwan is a breakaway province from the Chinese mainland. That's where, at the end of, in 1949, the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek took his government, or his military and his leadership, over to Taiwan and set up what he called a new country, and China called a breakaway state. And there's been tension between them ever since. But China, until recently, never really had the capacity, because Taiwan was taken under the protection of the West, specifically the United States. Taiwan, Hong Kong, places like that have agreements with the American military for protection against any Chinese aggression. And for the vast part of the last century, that's been what's kept China at bay. Well, that's quickly changing. China, the Americans under Donald Trump decided they were going to rebuild their Navy. When they launched this in 2020, they launched 7 warships of different classes. Well, as of, April 27th of this year, which is yesterday, they launched 3 in one day, which represents an increase in their total tonnage for their Navy of 70,000. They are now the only Navy that floats more steel than China is the United States, and that's changing fast. So here's what they launched. They launched, if I can find the right part in the story, there we are, the People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, the Chinese Navy, inducted the 3 ships, a guided missile cruiser, an amphibious assault ship, and a ballistic missile submarine into service on the 23rd of April, with the president of China, Xi Jinping, attending the ceremony on Hainan Island. The commission reflected the breakneck pace of China's naval shipbuilding program, which has transformed the country's navy from a meager coastal defense force into the second most powerful navy in the world in just 30 years. That is remarkable, especially when you consider the kind, like, this isn't World War II where they were popping out, Liberty ships, one a week. You just don't do that anymore. The naval vessels are just too sophisticated. The only weapons platform more sophisticated than modern surface ship is a submarine. And when you get to that, if you can start building your own submarines, you have reached a technical proficiency that most countries never get near. So the only question that remains, first of all, besides, okay, why the buildup? I think it's, if you've been following international politics, you realize that this is to bolster, because this is all taking place. They launched these into the South China Sea, not far from Taiwan, relative to Canada. And they're making it clear that they're going to want to take Taiwan back sooner rather than later, and they will use military force to do it if necessary. And when you think about the agreements between Taiwan, with Japan, with the United States, and different navies in the region, that could very easily lead to at least a large-scale regional war, if not an all-out an all-out world war. And this is the kind of thing that we should be paying attention to rather than what we have been paying attention to, because if you have that equipment and you play with it long enough, you're going to figure out the best way to use it. And while I don't know how good the Chinese military is on a man-to-man basis with the Western navies, I do know that given enough time, they will be, if they're not already, a very serious threat. And that's the part that has me nervous.
Well, the thing about the Navy is that while the quality of the sailor is always important, it's not always decisive. And, you know, a good ship with the great technology can overcome or can cover over some of the deficiencies or lack of training with naval personnel. So it's important to remember that it's not always a straight line. It's the buildup of the Chinese Navy is very important to pay attention to, Nick. Not just because of regional tensions with Taiwan, but because navies are about projecting power on the world stage. That's thing right. About a ballistic missile submarine is you don't have your ballistic missile submarine sitting off your coast where you know, picture the skipper of the submarine or the watch officer looking out his periscope to see if any enemy ships are approaching, okay? The whole purpose of a ballistic submarine is that you park it off the coast of your main enemy, thereby neutralizing the deterrent effect of his air and land-based nuclear weapons or other strategic weapons. So the whole idea is to project power, and you project power not in your own backyard, but you project it into the backyard of your opponents. So this is the whole idea of having a Navy. There is no, you know, other than what we are engaged in here in this country, largely search and rescue, drug and environmental protection, drug interdiction, that kind of stuff. So largely here in Canada, our role is domestic oriented and law and order oriented. And while we do participate in our international the NATO fleet, and we do participate in international naval operations, our participation is somewhat limited in terms of volume of numbers of ships, etc. So even in those fleets and operations where Canadians have commanded the operation, they've commanded the operation not because most of the ships in the fleet are Canadian, but because it just so happened that for either political reasons or perhaps experience reasons, etc., or just simply rotational reasons, it happened to be that a Canadian commander was deemed to be the most appropriate in this particular circumstance. So, but you could have a Canadian fleet commander and only have 2 Canadian destroyers out of 45 ships, for instance. I'm just drawing those numbers out of the air completely to illustrate the point. So our Navy isn't so much about projecting power. Our Navy is about domestic protection and about participating, meeting our treaty obligations, our international obligations. The American Navy, on the other hand, the Russian Navy, for the Soviet Navy for many years, not so much these days, although the Russians have been engaged in a rebuilding and rehabilitation program for a couple of years now, which is something that ought to be on our radar. But the American Navy is about projecting power, and I would argue projecting power for good. The Soviet Navy was not about projecting power for good, but let's say it was about projecting power to offset its paranoia about what the American intentions were. The British have obligations above and beyond our obligations. They have territories that they have to defend right around the world that we don't have to consider, really. So it's not just about projecting power for the British, but it's about providing logistical and defense support for British.
Are you telling me, Joseph, that we shouldn't go to war with Denmark over Hans Island?
I would be very surprised if that turns into a shooting war.
Well, it did with the Shetland, with the not the Shetlands, the what is it? They're off Argentina.
The Falklands.
Falklands, yeah.
Well, of course, but that was it. That and the Falklands is still a potential international trouble spot, I would say. But getting back to China, there is no justification, there is no explanation for the Chinese to be building up their naval forces, considering the fact that China is by and large still a developing country with a massive population. I mean, that they would spend billions of dollars on building up a naval force, which is by definition is not exactly going to employ. You're not going to have a naval force of 1 million or 2 million personnel. So you can't even make the argument that you're building it up as a method of employing the unemployed. Okay, so the only explanation is yes, to project power, but to project power to deter the free countries, the democracies, from intervening to defend those democracies that exist in Southeast Asia that may be feeling somewhat under threat from the Chinese communists, particularly Taiwan.
Yeah, I think you're quite right on that score. And the other thing to keep in mind, too, is that like Britain in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, they see themselves as empire building. They have the Silk Road program, which is when they they're reestablishing those routes for the taking in of raw resources. They've got they buy harbors and they buy all kinds of not supplies, but in Africa they're a big player in gathering resources. They've made comments like, "Well, China has 1/3 the world's population, so we should get 1/3 of the resources, whatever resources are in the Arctic." They're a very resource-driven country, not only for economic reasons, but for control reasons. Power comes in many forms. Military is only one of them, but military supports the other forms. Like if you have a country, let's say, just to pick one, Chad, and you have an agreement with the Chinese government that you're going to let them come in and extract a certain element or a certain mineral, or maybe oil or whatever it is, and then